most powerful communicators understand the big picture of what they're communicating and how all of the individual little pieces contribute to that. And novel writing is no different. Understanding the big picture of your story can help you write it and edit it more effectively, as well as market it more effectively. And one of the best ways to understand the big picture is to have a good outlining process. So I'm going to outline in this video 3 major ways you can outline your story, as well as 7 different sub-variants so you can get a feel of how people have personalized this approach to outlining. And at the end of this video, I'm going to show you how these can work together and different ways you can use them, whether or not you are a plotter who likes to write things out, organize and plot and outline things in advance, or whether you're a pantser, you fly by the seat of your pants writing whatever comes to mind, and then you do a lot of structural editing afterwards. So stay tuned. These outlining processes can help you write and edit more efficiently, as well as know what to market better when it comes time to sell your book. The more you understand the big picture, the less time you are going to spend lost in the weeds, which is critical when you are working a day job, writing, taking care of your family, and learning how to market your book. So one of the oldest, best known, and most popular approaches to understanding stories is the 3-act structure. There's a setup, there's a confrontation, and there's a resolution. And generally speaking, people have started to evolve a little of sub-steps between these 3 acts. So in the setup, you might have the beginning, the inciting incident, a second thoughts, climax of Act 1, and Act 2, you might have, or the confrontation, you might have obstacles and twists at the midpoint, more obstacles, disaster, climax of Act 2, and the resolution, you actually have the climax at the beginning, and then you have descending action, wrap up, and etc. So that is the 3-act structure. The pros of this is it's very minimalist, right? Thinking in terms of 3 larger phases. The cons are I think it's so general that it doesn't help me get a lot of insight. And in fact, the more you break it down into sub-steps and look like some of these later outlining options, the more helpful it gets, which is kind of a signal to me that like I wouldn't use this most often on my own. I think what this is probably good for is getting a very general idea of what's going on in your story, and then organizing the later more specific steps or story beats into 3 phases. In fact, that's something I noticed quite often as I was doing the research on additional kind of more elaborate story outlining methods, is that they very often divide their story beats or story steps into 3 different buckets, which kind of resemble Act 1. So this is really, I think, more of an organizing principle for the rest of your outline rather than sufficient outlining on its own. Although, again, getting that mile-high view sometimes might be helpful, especially if you have a hard time describing your book in summary. Now, I do want to cover just briefly, so you're aware of it, one variation, which is Freytag's pyramid, or the 5-act structure. And so this structure is exposition, rising action, climax, falling action, and denouement. These are things that are covered within the 3-act. It just kind of breaks them into more distinct phases. Personally, I'm not a huge fan. For example, it makes the climax look like it's really in the middle of things, which is weird. I accidentally did that in my first novel, and I had to figure out how to undo that, and I wasn't trying, and I wasn't using Freytag's pyramid, it just kind of happened. But it's certainly not something that I would enshrine in the structure of my outline. And then also having a whole phase for exposition. A lot of writers struggle with leaving too much exposition and not getting straight to the action and letting the viewers kind of discover more of that backstory through little pieces as the story goes on, right? Like that's the ideal. So having this placeholder for exposition at the beginning, I feel like is just going to foster that bad habit of having too much exposition. So I'm not a huge fan of that variation, but it's there so you can take a look at it. Hey, quick interruption. So my mission is to fix the internet for sci-fi and fantasy creators and fan bases. I think there are reasons why it is so hard to build a following and support yourself.
mainly that like most websites aren't built for building communities and fan bases. They're built so large websites can advertise to your audience, and so that's just hugely broken and insane. It should not be as hard as it is to create a following and support yourself on creative work. Doesn't mean everyone's going to get there, but I would like more people to be able to support themselves with their creative work. That's my mission. This channel is just the beginning of that. I want to build better websites and tools. If you like and subscribe, you can help me build the channel and more quickly get to a place where I can build you tools that will make this whole business of writing thing easier. So please, like and subscribe, share. That's great. That too, yes, please. Or tell me, if this video is not good enough to earn your like and subscribe, tell me below in the comments what I could give you that would be more valuable. Thanks.
Coming from an English lit and creative writing background, the outlining system that I was most familiar with was the hero's journey. So this was popularized by Joseph Campbell, but it was compressed in 2007 into 12 steps and kind of modernized by Christopher Vogler. So when you hear about a 12-step hero journey, that's going back to Vogler, and I have yet a third, even more streamlined version from a popular showrunner that I will share, Dan Harmon, that I will also share. So there's 3 variants of this, and I'll dive into each one. So the first variant of the hero's journey is Joseph Campbell's version, came out in the mid-20th century, and it's very Jungian in its flavor. You'll see as I dive into the steps. I find, just an aside with all of these, actually that very often people divide them into 3 phases, and so you'll see a little bit of the 3-act structure sneaking into the hero's journey, or at least when people describe it, right? There's a departure phase, there's an initiation phase, and a return phase. So for Joseph Campbell, that looks like the call to adventure, the refusal of the call, some supernatural aid, crossing the first threshold, and then being in the belly of the whale or being overwhelmed. So that's the departure phase that kind of leads the hero from where they were into complete chaos or being overwhelmed. Then there's the initiation phase where they're starting to come to terms with things, and there's kind of like, 2 steps forward, 1 step back. Or sometimes the reverse. But the initiation phase, there's a road of trials, there's meeting with the goddess, there's the woman as temptress, atonement with the father, and then apotheosis. So that's the phase kind of leading up to the climax. And then the last phase is the return. So there's the ultimate boon, they got everything they wanted. There's the refusal of the return. There's the magic flight, the rescue from without, crossing the return threshold, being master of both worlds, and lastly, the freedom to live. So you can see that Jungian flavor. It leans very heavily into male-female archetypes, meeting with the goddess, the woman as temptress, the atonement with the father. These are also things that I think you see a lot more in mythical and fairy tale language, like folktale language, rather than more modern storytelling. A good example of this would be the refusal of the return. You see that in a lot of fairy tales where, someone makes it into the magical castle or magical fairyland and finds their place, and then it's time to come back and they don't want to. That does happen sometimes in more modern literature, but it's more universal in mythic literature. So I would say for this variant, maybe one of the things that it's really good for is if you want to have a more traditional folktale, if you like the archetypes, etc., go back to Joseph Campbell's classic version. Now there's a streamlined version by Christopher Vogler where there are 12 steps. So if you hear the 12-step hero's journey, that's Vogler, and it's redesigned a little bit for more modern audiences and less with the archetypes built into it. So in the departure phase, there's an ordinary world, there's a call to adventure, there's refusing the call, there's meeting with the mentor, right? Rather than supernatural aid, right? It's kind of taken some of that mythic quality out of it. And then there's crossing the first threshold. Interestingly, there's no belly of the whale. So in the initiation phase, There's tests, allies, and enemies, which is kind of compressing a lot of the things that Joseph Campbell talked about, specifically in terms of male and female archetypes. And then there's the approach to the inmost cave, which is very yonic, but not specifically male or female. Again, he's kind of generalizing and pulling some of those archetypes out. There's the ordeal and the reward, and again, it's a reward rather than apotheosis, right? The becoming divine, and so less mythic here. And lastly, there's the return phase, the road back, the resurrection, the return with the elixir. And so notice there's no refusal of the call or like magic flight to rescue from without. Like this phase is also very streamlined. So again, fewer steps, a little bit more streamlined for modern audiences, less into the folktale myth stories. And so this is kind of a better for a more modern tale. And lastly, there's a variant that I think is really interesting from creator Dan Harmon of Community and Rick and Morty fame. And so he visualizes basically the character's journey, or the hero's journey, as a circle with 8 steps. There's a character in a zone of comfort, but they want something. They enter into an unfamiliar situation, they adapt to it, they get what they wanted, but they pay a heavy price for it. Then return to their familiar situation, having changed. So the most streamlined of these, you'll also notice a couple of other things that it is driven by the character, right? There isn't a call to action, which is a little generic, but often interpreted as external. It's internal. The character wants something. And the other thing you'll notice that is, again, more internal and more particular to the character is it ends up with them having changed and a lot less of the impact, right? The external impact. In Joseph Campbell's, you have the master of both worlds, typically that they become a savior of their community or whatever, and that's also reflected very often with the Vogelers in terms of return with the elixir. You return with something of value for other people. It's not forbidden, but it's also not necessarily happening in Dan Harmon's version of those 8 steps. So it's less messianic, less mythic, and even more character-driven, I think even more modern. So you can take any of these, you can mix and match, you can create your own steps. You don't actually have to stick to these, but these guys give you a good starting point, and they're a little bit more specific than the 3-act structure. Now, in practice, as I said before, I see these two blending into each other, bleeding into each other a lot. So people who like the 3-act structure tend to create these story steps or story beats much like the hero's journey. So in one of the descriptions of the 3-act structure, right, there's an inciting incident or call to adventure. There was, is it debate or second thoughts or something I saw in one explanation of the 3-act structure? That's refusal of the call. So again, you see that, and likewise with the hero's journey, there's those 3 phases that kind of reflect the 3-act structure. So what I find is that the 3-act structure is good for organizing your large story steps, and then the hero's journey fills in those chunky hero steps. So that is, they kind of complement each other. So one other thing that is great about the hero's journey perspective is that it charts a transformation or development of the main character that feels earned. They're initially in a comfortable spot, something or some desire pulls them out of it, they face lots of trials or they pay a heavy price in Dan Harmon's terminology, and then they get what they want, they come back having changed, etc. So I think that is a helpful perspective of the hero's journey as well. It's not just a series of things that happen, but is a transformation in a transformation in the main character, so it marries plot and character development. The one limitation I would say of this method is that while it's good for getting the high picture out on paper and might be really helpful for you learning how to pitch your story in a few words or short words, this is less helpful for scene-by-scene writing or editing. So if you do your outline before writing a scene, then this is still a little vague and it's somewhat helpful, but doesn't help you for particular scenes, right? There might be the refusing the call might be split over multiple scenes. Clearly, test allies and enemies in Vogler's middle section. That's probably several scenes, and so it's still kind of chunky, a little too generic, I think, for like scene by scene help writing. Or if you're a pantser and you write first and you want to go and structurally edit for pacing, then it's still, again, it will help you understand where that scene lies in the big picture, but it won't help you with the pacing and purpose of individual scenes quite as much. So for that, I recommend a particular take on the next outlining method. So the third major approach to outlining stories is the beat sheet or beat analysis. It's popularized by screenwriter Blake Snyder in his book Save the Cat. And in many versions, it essentially breaks down the 3-act structure into different large steps or story beats. I believe from Save the Cat, it was something like an opening image, a setup, the theme is stated, there's a catalyst or call to adventure, there's a debate or refusal of the call. There is, anyway, there's a break into the section 2 or act 2, the B story fun, and then fun and games. There's a midpoint, there's bad guys close in, all is lost, there's the dark night, and then you break into 3, there's the finale and final image. So it does sound a little bit like the hero's journey. I think what's different about this is that it has become popularized in a way that people have broken down beats for different genres. And so there's like, you could get someone's horror beat sheet, etc. And so it's kind of like the hero's journey, less mythological, more genre-based, and often more personalized. And so that is one of the advantages of kind of this beat approach. If you're looking for that, you could look for a beat sheet for your genre and get something that's kind of like a hero's journey or comparable, but specifically for the kinds of stories that you tell. So that's helpful. However, I actually prefer a more specific method of beat analysis that I came across in Robin D. Law's book, Hamlet's Hit Points. So this is actually a book on how to tell stories for people running tabletop RPG games like Dungeons & Dragons, which is interesting. And that means since you are improvising as the storyteller and you don't know what the characters are going to do, you've got to break things down and think scene by scene or within a scene, what should the next beat look like? So it's a little more granular, and I find this granular approach is a great supplement to the other ones. So in Law's book, he labels the book as the beats as there's procedural, which bring a protagonist's external or practical goals into play. They could be getting further away or closer to those goals. There's dramatic, which is the same thing, but investing us in protagonist's internal goals. And again, they could be getting closer or further away from those. There's commentary, which is rare and should be used rarely, which is taking a break from the story to comment on it, but it's a thing. There's anticipation, which is expectation of a procedural success. And so, that's the hero shot right before the action scene where they're looking, they're looking really tough and great or whatnot. There's the suspense, expectation of something bad happening. You could have the reverse for the villain, right? The villain's big entrance, right? Is they haven't done anything horrible yet, or they haven't done anything horrible to the main character yet, but with their version of their big shot entrance, we're anticipating a big fight, bad things to happen, right? There's also, and so that's anticipation is we're thinking procedural success. Suspense is something procedural bad happening, right? There's gratification, which is a positive emotional moment that's not necessarily tied to the story. It doesn't move the plot forward. So I really, really came to hate Lost. But early on, one of the things that I did appreciate about it in episode like 1 or 2 is, all these people have been in a plane crash and it's stress and mystery. And then they randomly take a moment out they find a place where they could play golf, and they have some fine golf clubs or something. They got them from somewhere anyway, and they play a round of golf, and that was like a little bit of emotional relief in contrast to all of the tension and suspense. It didn't really have to do with the plot. That would be a great example of a gratification beat, but there's also the opposite beat, which is a bring down beat, a negative emotion beat that doesn't necessarily have to do with the plot. So often this is used to drive home a negative scene. So something bad happens in the plot, and then all of a sudden it starts downpouring on the main character. That rain usually isn't a plot point moving the character closer to or further from their goals. It's just to underscore and add an additional negative beat on top of a negative procedural beat that just happened, and drive that home. Or, sometimes that could be used in comedy where there's a emotional upbeat and then a sudden downbeat just as kind of a surprise gotcha silly clownery. So then there's the pipe, which gives you information for later without tipping you off, or it gives the audience information for later without tipping them off. So that's just kind of set up. And then question, so you introduce a point of curiosity, so introduce a mystery, etc. In the plot, and then there's a reveal that satisfies our curiosity. And the goal of having all these beats is to have a good mix of up and down beats, of internal and external, like procedural and dramatic beats, of opening questions and resolving them, of positive, negative emotions, etc. And so the idea is that you can analyze either each scene in terms of that, or even each major action within a scene, and get a good mix that keeps the audience on the edge of their seat. Whereas if you were hitting the same beat over and over and over again, which is, maybe the character, I'm remembering Harry Potter camping in the woods in the last book, and it's just like nothing, they're frustrated that nothing's happening. 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 Like, beat-wise, that was one of the worst pacing nightmares I have ever read in a popular book. And that would be an example of doing that wrong. There just weren't enough other kinds of beats going on to keep that camping scene effective. So, anyway, the pros of this, it's very flexible. It's kind of small to mid detail, so it can do some of those things the other larger outlines can't, which is particularly helping with pacing on a scene level or within a scene level. And and again, it doesn't tell you which order they have to come in, so it's more flexible. The cons are it's more time consuming. It's not one thing. You kind of have to play around with this a little bit to figure out what is the right size of a beat for you. For me, I really like generally, when I'm thinking of outlining a story, I think a scene is as granular as I want to get, but if I'm really workshopping a scene, then the nice thing is it's flexible and I can kind of redefine the size of a beat to be actions within a scene. So there you have it. You have the 3-act structure and the hero's journey and the beat sheet, 3 different approaches to how to outline your story. Let me give you a few practical examples of how you might go ahead and use these for help with writing, editing, and marketing. Well, I think that answer is going to differ whether you are a plotter and you like to plot things out in advance, or whether you are a pantser, you kind of like to discover as you write, and then maybe bring in more of that structure later in editing. So if you're a plotter, then you can go ahead and chart out your 3 acts and then break that down at whatever level you want to, whether you use one of the hero's journeys phases or whether you go and get a beat sheet, for example, for your particular genre, and then you customize it. You have kind of the major steps. Not quite scene level, but like the major steps, the major turns in the story. All right. And then, depending on the level of detail you want, you might fill out all of the scenes with what story beat they have for the whole story, or maybe you just do that a phase at a time, depending on how much you want to think through. Maybe you're just thinking a couple steps ahead in terms of scenes, or maybe you want to try outlining the whole thing. It's up to you. So you can do that while you're writing. You should probably think of this as a living document. So if you do discover things while you're writing and editing, you update that. And this serves kind of as a large-scale zoomed out map. So you kind of always know where you are, and that will help you not get lost or sidetracked when writing or editing. And that also makes some of the action really clear for marketing. So if there are different ways to market. You might market by making the main character relatable and focusing on like the ordinary world setup, or the call to adventure might be really exciting, etc. The mentor figures, or the promise of reward, or the stakes, right? Some of these things, these major steps from the beats or the hero's journey, might be good selling points to get people excited. And they will certainly help you talk about your book in a clear and succinct manner, so you're not confusing people by just throwing out details that people don't know how to put together. So that is if you're a plotter. If you're a pantser and you like to discover things as you write, you obviously would probably avoid sitting down and writing out an outline. I mean, if you've never done that before, it might be an interesting exercise and try and write a book that way. But if you've tried and that doesn't work for you, then you might need something a little bit more flexible. And so what you might do is you might fill out a few of these hero journey steps just to figure out what your beginning is, what your angle is, who's the main character, what is their ordinary or status quo, what is the call to adventure or inciting incident or whatever, right? You might just outline a few of those barest ideas to get you started writing. But then what you might do on a scene-by-scene basis or chapter-by-chapter basis is you might do a beats analysis for what you've already written. So after you finish a scene or chapter, then go back and look through the major story beats and see what you're writing and see what maybe you're missing. Maybe it's all procedural, you're all focused on the characters' external goals, and it might benefit from a little bit more development of like their internal goals and motivations, etc. Maybe it's been really bleak. Maybe you really want to hammer that home with a bring down beat, or maybe you want to break that up like in Lost with a gratification beat in the midst of all that, suspense and danger. So you can kind of chart as you go, and instead of charting ahead, just look back at what you have, and then your next scene, think about what kind of beat could bring more variety and interest to your story. So that's how you would use it as you're writing. And then when you hit the editing phase, you might go and fill out the whole journey. And if you've been tracking beats as you go, you already have the beats and whatnot. You might do a diagram where you connect the beats, right, to steps of the hero's journey. To make sure everything is moving the plot forward. You might have like a procedural beat that you realize doesn't really help with this character's transformation or like the character's goal or whatever, and so you might cut that beat from the story, and make sure that this book or whatever you're writing is focused on whatever the main character's action, transformation, etc. is. So that's how you would bring that in. And as I said before, this will help you marketing in the same way once you've done this work, so that you can succinctly answer questions about your book when you're marketing it, when you're posting, when you're in interviews, etc. So you may have noticed that these three outlining methods are very plot-focused framework. What happens first, what happens next, etc. So there are other frameworks for thinking about writing that will help you less with the plot and pacing and maybe more with the characterization and theme. These are frameworks that I will be sharing with you in my next video. So if this has been helpful and you're curious about these other frameworks that might get you unstuck or improve the quality of your characterization, then go ahead and subscribe and hit the like button so you are more likely to get that next video. See you next time on the Ubiquitous Tavern.